Admiral James Carter stepped into the airport, feeling relieved after a long and exhausting overseas mission. He was looking forward to a comfortable flight home. Though he had traveled the world and faced many challenges, he always appreciated the small moments, like sitting back in a first-class seat, sipping coffee, and enjoying a peaceful flight. He walked toward the check-in counter, pulling his carry-on bag behind him. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, he looked like an ordinary traveler. His face held a calm and friendly expression as he handed over his passport and ticket. The airline agent gave a quick nod and processed his boarding pass without issue. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. As James made his way toward the first-class boarding line, he noticed a woman standing nearby. She was neatly dressed, holding an expensive handbag, and had an impatient look on her face. At first, James paid her no attention, assuming she was just another busy traveler. But as he stepped into the line, he heard a sharp voice directed at him. "Excuse me, sir," the woman said, frowning. "I think you're in the wrong line. This is for first-class passengers only." James turned to her, slightly surprised. He was used to being treated with respect wherever he went, but he had also learned that not everyone saw people the same way. He glanced at her politely and responded with a simple, "I know. I'm in the right place." The woman, however, wasn't convinced. She gave him a long, doubtful look, then shook her head. "No, I don't think so. They must have made a mistake with your ticket." James remained calm, not letting her words bother him. He had faced far more difficult situations in his life. He held up his ticket and smiled. "My ticket says first class. I believe it's correct." Before he could step forward, the woman turned to the airline staff. "Can you please check this? I don't think he's supposed to be here," she said in a firm voice. The gate agent hesitated, looking between James and the woman. Instead of simply confirming the ticket and letting James board, the agent seemed unsure, as if considering the woman's doubts. This made James sigh quietly. He had seen this kind of reaction before. Still, he remained patient. He placed his boarding pass on the counter and waited for the agent to check it. Around them, other passengers watched in silence, sensing the tension. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed curious about how things would unfold. James didn't say much. He knew his identity would be revealed soon enough. For now, he simply wanted to see how far this situation would go before the truth came out. The airline agent hesitated as they looked at James' ticket. The system showed he was indeed a first-class passenger, but the woman beside him was still not satisfied. She crossed her arms and shook her head, clearly unwilling to accept the truth. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice growing sharper. "Maybe he got upgraded at the last minute. People don't just buy first-class tickets like that." James watched her calmly, still saying nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing with people like her was pointless. Instead, he let his actions and the truth speak for him. The gate agent finally nodded, handing James his boarding pass. "Your seat is confirmed, sir. You're good to go." James reached for the ticket, but before he could take it, the woman stepped forward again. "Wait. Are you sure? Can you check again?" she insisted. "This doesn't seem right. First class is meant for certain kinds of people." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing she had spoken too much. A few nearby passengers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with her attitude. A man standing in the next line muttered something under his breath, but no one spoke up directly. James, however, remained calm. He had faced tough situations all his life, and a small incident at an airport wasn't going to shake him. Instead of arguing, he simply took his boarding pass and smiled politely. "Thank you," he said to the gate agent before stepping forward. But the woman still wasn't done. As James walked toward the boarding area, she hurried after him, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. "Excuse me, I need to talk to someone in charge," she said loudly, waving down a flight attendant. The attendant, a young woman with a professional smile, approached. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "This man," the woman said, pointing directly at James, "was somehow allowed into first class. I think you should double-check his ticket before he takes someone else's seat." The flight attendant blinked in surprise, looking from James to the woman. "Ma'am, if his ticket says first class, then he has the right seat," she said in a calm voice. "But that can't be," the woman argued. "There are certain standards in first class. Are you really going to let just anyone sit there?" Now the surrounding passengers were paying close attention. A few people shifted uncomfortably, while others whispered to each other. Some of them looked annoyed, clearly impatient to board their flights. James let out a small sigh. He had hoped the situation would end quickly, but it seemed the woman wouldn't let it go. He glanced at the flight attendant and said in a steady voice, "Would you like to check my ticket again?" The attendant shook her head. "No need, sir. You're good to board." James nodded, but before he could take another step, the woman turned to the flight crew again. "I want to speak to the pilot. This is unacceptable." James raised an eyebrow, now curious to see how far she would take this. Instead of feeling frustrated, he was simply waiting to see how this would all unfold. The flight attendant looked slightly uncomfortable, but remained professional. She turned to the woman and said, "Ma'am, the pilot is currently preparing for takeoff. If there's a real issue, I can call someone from customer service to assist you." But the woman wasn't satisfied. She let out an annoyed sigh and shook her head. "No, I want to speak to the pilot. This is first class. People pay a lot of money for these seats, and we deserve to know who we're sitting with," she said, folding her arms tightly. James, still standing there, remained calm. He had dealt with all kinds of situations before, some much more intense than this. If the woman thought she could shake him, she was wrong. He simply adjusted his bag over his shoulder and waited. At this point, other passengers were starting to get annoyed. A man in a business suit muttered, "Can we just board already?" while a woman behind him sighed, shaking her head. The delay was unnecessary, and most people just wanted to get to their seats. The flight attendant, now realizing that the woman wouldn't let it go, finally said, "All right, ma'am. I'll inform the pilot. But please step aside so the other passengers can board." The woman huffed but nodded, stepping to the side while James walked forward. As he reached the plane's entrance, he could hear her still grumbling to herself. He smiled slightly. He had a feeling this wasn't over just yet. Once inside the plane, James found his seat in first class, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down. He leaned back, adjusting his seatbelt, and let out a slow breath. It had been a long trip, and all he wanted now was to relax. But just as he was getting comfortable, he heard a familiar voice. "I told you, I need to speak to the pilot. This is completely unacceptable." James turned his head slightly and saw the woman standing at the front of the plane, talking to a different flight attendant. Her face was red with frustration, and her hands were moving wildly as she spoke. The flight attendant nodded and disappeared into the cockpit for a moment. A few seconds later, the pilot himself stepped out. He was a tall man with a neatly pressed uniform and a confident presence. He walked up to the woman and gave her a polite but firm look. "Ma'am, I was told you wanted to speak with me. What seems to be the problem?" The woman pointed toward James without hesitation. "That man was somehow allowed into first class, and I think there's been a mistake. You need to check if he really belongs here." The pilot followed her gaze toward James, then looked back at her. He raised an eyebrow before stepping closer. "Ma'am, are you questioning one of my passengers?" "Yes. People work hard for first-class seats. We can't just let anyone sit here," she insisted. The pilot nodded slowly. Then he turned back toward James, his expression shifting as he took a closer look at him. Something in his eyes changed as if he suddenly recognized him. James remained seated, waiting for what would happen next. The pilot took a step closer, his sharp eyes studying James for a moment. Then, as if a light had switched on in his mind, His expression changed. A look of recognition crossed his face, followed by immediate respect. "Sir," the pilot said, his tone shifting, "it's an honor to have you on board." James gave a small nod but remained seated, watching as the woman's face twisted in confusion. She looked back and forth between James and the pilot, not understanding what was happening. "Wait, what?" she asked, her voice less confident now. "Do you know him?" The pilot turned to her with a firm but polite expression. "Yes, ma'am, I do." He straightened his posture and gave James a respectful nod. "Admiral Carter, sir, welcome aboard." The woman's mouth fell open slightly. Admiral," she stammered. James sighed quietly, finally deciding to speak up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his official military ID, holding it up for her to see. The ID clearly displayed his full name and rank. "Admiral James Carter, United States Navy." "I believe this should clear up any confusion," James said calmly. The woman blinked several times, her face slowly turning red. She opened her mouth as if to say something but quickly closed it again. For the first time since this whole situation started, she had nothing to say. The passengers around them had gone silent, listening to the conversation unfold. Now, murmurs began spreading through the cabin. A few people exchanged knowing glances, while others looked at the woman with clear disapproval. The pilot, still standing tall, kept his gaze on the woman. "Ma'am," he said in a serious tone, "Admiral Carter has served this country with honor. He has every right to sit in first class. There was never a mistake." The woman shifted uncomfortably, her confidence completely gone. She looked down at the floor, avoiding everyone's eyes. I didn't know," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. James, who had remained patient throughout the entire ordeal, finally let out a small sigh. "Next time, maybe don't be so quick to judge," he said, his voice kind but firm. The pilot nodded in agreement before turning back to the flight attendants. "Make sure Admiral Carter is taken care of," he instructed. Then he looked at the woman. "As for you, ma'am, please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." The woman nodded quickly and hurried to her seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. James leaned back in his chair, finally able to relax. The flight attendant returned with a warm smile. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked. James shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you," he said, appreciating the change in tone from earlier. As the plane prepared for departure, James closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't angry. He had seen many things in his lifetime, but he hoped this was a lesson the woman, and everyone watching, would never forget. As the plane started boarding the last few passengers, James leaned back in his seat, finally able to breathe and relax. The situation had played out exactly as he expected. He had seen it happen before, people making assumptions based on appearance alone. But now, everything was settled, and he was ready to enjoy his flight. The woman, however, looked completely different from before. Her confidence had vanished, and she sat stiffly in her seat just a few rows behind James. She stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone around her. The other passengers had witnessed everything, and it was clear they weren't on her side. A few rows away, a man in a business suit whispered to the woman next to him, shaking his head. Another passenger gave James a respectful nod, as if silently apologizing for what had happened earlier. James didn't react. He wasn't looking for an apology from anyone. He just wanted peace. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, making sure everyone was settled. One of them stopped by James' seat, offering him a warm smile. "Sir, we truly apologize for any inconvenience. If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." James gave a small nod. "I appreciate it. Thank you." The pilot's voice soon came over the intercom, announcing their departure and giving the usual safety instructions. As the flight attendants performed the safety demonstration, James glanced out the window. The airport runway stretched out before them, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the planes lined up in the distance. As the plane taxied toward the runway, James heard a quiet voice from behind him. "Excuse me." He turned slightly, already knowing who it was. The woman from earlier stood beside his seat, her hands nervously gripping the back of the chair in front of her. Her face was no longer filled with arrogance. It was uncertain now, almost embarrassed. James raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, waiting for her to speak. She hesitated, taking a small breath before continuing. "I wanted to say, I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean any harm." James studied her for a moment. He could tell she was struggling with her words, but he also knew that if he had been anyone else, if he hadn't been an admiral, she probably wouldn't be apologizing at all. Still, he wasn't the type to hold grudges. "I understand," he said simply. The woman nodded quickly, clearly relieved that he wasn't going to embarrass her further. She turned and hurried back to her seat as the flight attendants gave her a warning look for standing during takeoff. James exhaled quietly, shaking his head slightly. He had seen moments like this before, people only realizing their mistake when the truth was revealed. He hoped, for her sake, that she had learned something from this experience. The plane's engines roared as they prepared for takeoff. James leaned back into his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. Whatever had happened before, it was behind him now. All he wanted was a peaceful flight home. As the plane took off, James felt the familiar push against his seat. He had been on more flights than he could count, but there was always something calming about watching the world get smaller beneath him. The city lights, the roads, and the buildings all became tiny dots as the plane climbed higher into the sky. He took a deep breath and adjusted his seat, ready to enjoy the quiet. The tension from earlier had faded, and he hoped the rest of the flight would be peaceful. A flight attendant soon came by, offering drinks and snacks. "Would you like something, sir?" she asked politely. James smiled. "Just coffee, please." She nodded and returned a few moments later with a steaming cup. As he took his first sip, he heard a soft cough from behind him. He already had a feeling who it was. Turning his head slightly, he saw the woman sitting a few rows back. She wasn't causing trouble anymore. Instead, she looked deep in thought, her fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. She seemed restless, as if something was still bothering her. James wasn't sure if she was going to say anything else. But then, to his surprise, she stood up and slowly walked toward him again. This time, there was no frustration in her face, just hesitation. "Excuse me," she said softly. James put his coffee down and looked up at her. "Yes." The woman shifted awkwardly, glancing around as if making sure no one was paying attention. She took a small breath before speaking. I wanted to apologize again. I realize now that I was wrong." James stayed silent, letting her continue. She lowered her eyes, looking embarrassed. "I made an assumption about you without knowing anything. I shouldn't have done that. It wasn't fair to you." James studied her for a moment. He could tell this wasn't easy for her. Admitting a mistake never was. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that," he said simply. The woman gave a weak smile. I've never met someone like you before. I didn't expect." She stopped herself and shook her head. "No, that's not an excuse. I should have treated you with respect from the start." James took a sip of his coffee before replying. "People often judge too quickly," he said, "but what matters is whether they learn from it." She swallowed hard, nodding. "I will." For the first time, James saw something genuine in her expression. She seemed to truly regret her actions. Maybe this experience had changed something in her. "Enjoy your flight," James said, giving her a small nod. She let out a nervous breath, then quickly returned to her seat. James leaned back once again, feeling a sense of peace. He hadn't expected an apology, but he could tell it was sincere. Maybe this flight had taught her a lesson she would never forget. As the flight continued, James allowed himself to finally relax. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift peacefully past. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, and most passengers were either reading, sleeping, or watching movies. James took another sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in. He had spent most of his life in high-pressure situations, making tough decisions, leading teams, and representing his country. Sitting here, thousands of feet above the ground, was one of the few moments where he could just enjoy the quiet. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking on passengers. When one of them passed by, James gave her a polite nod. She smiled in return, still showing the extra respect he had received since the pilot addressed him by his rank. It wasn't something he asked for, but he understood why people reacted that way. A few rows back, the woman who had caused the earlier commotion sat silently. She hadn't spoken again since her apology, and James had no reason to think she would. But every now and then, he could sense her glancing in his direction, as if still processing what had happened. After some time, the flight crew announced dinner service. The first-class attendants moved quickly, setting trays in front of the passengers. When James received his meal, he unfolded his napkin and took a moment to enjoy the aroma of the freshly prepared food. It was a simple but well-made dish, much better than the meals he had eaten during long deployments. As he ate, he noticed the woman shifting in her seat again. It seemed like something was still on her mind. Then, after a deep breath, she stood up and slowly walked toward him once more. James set his fork down and looked up as she hesitated beside his seat. This time, her posture was completely different. No frustration, no arrogance, just quiet thoughtfulness. "May I sit?" she asked hesitantly. James gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Go ahead." She sat down carefully, folding her hands in her lap. There was a long pause before she spoke. "I just wanted to ask you something, if that's okay." James nodded. "Go ahead." She bit her lip slightly, thinking, "How did you get to where you are? I mean, becoming an admiral. That's not something I hear about every day." James leaned back slightly. He wasn't sure if she was asking out of curiosity or to make conversation, but either way, he decided to answer. "It wasn't easy," he said. "I had to work hard, stay disciplined, and prove myself every step of the way. There were challenges, many of them, but I kept pushing forward." She listened intently, nodding. "I guess I never thought about how much effort it takes to reach a position like yours." James looked at her for a moment. "Most people don't." She lowered her eyes, nodding slowly. "I guess I still have a lot to learn." James gave a small, understanding smile. "We all do." The woman sat quietly for a moment, as if lost in thought. James could see that something had shifted in her. She no longer carried the same confidence she had at the beginning of the flight, but instead there was a sense of reflection in her eyes. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "To be honest, I didn't think much about the people around me before today." James nodded, understanding her words. Sometimes, we don't realize how much we judge others until we're forced to see things differently. She sighed. "I guess that's true. I made an assumption about you without knowing anything about your life, your experience, or what you've done for this country." James took a sip of his coffee, then looked at her. "The important thing is, what will you do with this experience? Will it change how you see people in the future?" The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I think it will. I don't want to be someone who judges people unfairly. I was wrong, and I can admit that." James could tell her words were sincere. He had seen many people in his life, some who learned from their mistakes, and others who refused to change. She seemed to be one of the few who actually wanted to grow. Just then, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would be landing soon. Passengers started straightening up their seats and preparing for arrival. The woman gave James a small, almost shy smile. "Thank you for talking to me, and for not getting angry." James chuckled lightly. "I've faced bigger challenges than this, but I appreciate the apology." She nodded, standing up to return to her seat. As she walked back, she seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As the plane descended, James looked out the window once more. The city lights were glowing below, welcoming them back to solid ground. The experience on this flight had been unexpected, but he hoped that, at least for one person, it had been a lesson worth remembering. When the plane finally landed and taxied to the gate, passengers started gathering their belongings. As James stood to get his bag, the woman hesitated near the aisle. She looked at him one last time. "It was nice meeting you, Admiral Carter," she said with a respectful nod. James gave a nod in return. "Take care." With that, she disappeared into the crowd of passengers leaving the plane. James watched as people hurried off, eager to reach their destinations. He took his time, letting others go first. He had nowhere to rush to, just another journey, another experience. As he stepped off the plane, he could only hope that the lesson learned today would stay with the woman for a long time. Some moments in life change people. Maybe this had been one of them.